Wonderful. All right. Welcome everyone to Dying from the Ditches. My name is Orla O'Shanahan, mundanely known as Shannon Dobbs. We're going to start with some greetings and introductions. We did a little bit in advance, but I'd love to know from some of you your interest in dying and what you'd like to take away from the class. If you want to type that into chat, we can also use them to sort of further our discussions later too. I spent most of my life living in Eldemere, which is in the Great Lakes Basin, and I'm now living in the east, which is Nova Scotia. I'm saying this because regionality really matters to when you're thinking about foraging and looking for different materials around you. I began dyeing as a kid, and I discovered the incredible fastness of walnut husks and how they would stain your skin as soon as you handled them, and also the crushingly beautiful but totally fugitive it fades away so quickly on fabric, the nature of wild river grapes in my teens. And later on, through the SCI, began exploring dyeing more purposefully and methodically, although there's plenty of like, let's throw this in the pot and see how it works out. So I'd love to learn what's working for you in your area, and I'll try and share a little bit of my experiences and easy favorites. So moving along the overview, we're doing a short presentation, and about halfway through, we're going to move on to having open discussions. But I'd like to cover resources about plant identification, because before we're ever thinking about picking, we want to be very sure of what we're looking for, what we want to make sure we protect in terms of sensitive species or endangered species, and then having a really good idea about how and why plants are listed as noxious and invasive, which is a fair consideration when we're trying to move and transport them. Just a sec. There we are. Focusing on local. So for this class, we're focusing on locally available materials in our modern context, while understanding very much the importance and magnitude of the traded dye stuff throughout the medieval world. Dyes were, of course, regionally available. There's plants that will make color all over the world. But high quality dyes were grown and processed at significant scale, and they were transported, sold, and used elsewhere. For the home dyer, dye plants can be found growing enthusiastically in your area, are the ones that are likely the least expensive option, so long as you can get to them. Although even in the cityscape, I can sort of point out places where you might want to look for them. Often making them some of the more accessible entry points when you're just getting into dyeing or trying it out or seeing what you think about it. European settlers, as they arrived to North America, purposely brought many of the plants they were used to using with them. In many cases, this was bringing vigorous plants. Most of the dye plants actually grow really well if you give them their right niche, that were used in medieval times. So bringing some of these plants over, they're already vigorous plants, and they're being brought into ecosystems that have no co-evolved competition. The animals had sort of yet to learn to eat them, and some are basically inedible, which makes them a challenge as they entered into the ecosystems of North America. Woad, madder, dyer's greenweed, buckthorn, they're all very vibrant medieval dye plants. When you can learn to identify them and use them, some of these can all be found in and around different regions. So finding out if they're available in your area and keeping an eye out and learning a little bit of plant ID can go a long ways. Though there is also no shade whatsoever in purchasing the materials directly. There are some particularly like buckthorn, which is wildly invasive, and the removal of it from the ecosystem is pretty much always a good thing. Knowing the connection to the historical uses of these plants and bringing those dyeing practices forward to today in a modern context and using safe handling and all that, we can effectively and intentionally use and sometimes control the spread of some of these invasives, while also making and learning new things. A bit about weeds and invasives. Understanding what is invasive in your area is a really good place to start. Most natural resource organizations at the governmental level will have public listings of invasive species to be on the watch for. Some even have reporting requests. You'll especially see that around things that are really harmful to people, like giant hogweed and hemlock sometimes. As a reminder, not all the noxious weeds are invasive. Some absolutely have a place in our ecosystems. But where farming, livestock, and people are impacted tends to be where governments are most concerned. So those lists will skew to that. So a list might include poison ivy, which through most of the regions of North America I've been, which is sort of Ontario East, is a natural part of the ecosystem, but it's still listed as a noxious weed. So these lists aren't complete, but they're a really good starting point, and they're good to be aware of in a general sense because they usually sort of refer to safety, or they're referencing things that have or have had significant impact on the agricultural system. All right, so we're going to talk a bit about transporting native species. It's important to always be aware of the invasive plants that could be at sites. Now, these sites could be, we talk about ditches, but if you're going on a hiking trail before you're visiting, learn about them before you head out to forecast and explore. And when I say forecast is a way of looking at plants and evaluating how they might fit into the landscape when they're blooming, when they're fruiting, keeping an eye out for that and having a thought to how well they're doing in that landscape, if they're a strong community, if they're a sensitive community that's vulnerable, and when or if it might be appropriate to harvest. Simple things like cleaning your boots before heading into the natural area and again before you leave helps avoid unwanted seed transfer. Keeping collection or sample bags closed before and after collecting is especially important, especially if you're intentionally collecting seeds for a reason. I've got some pictures of some invasive species. Let's see, top to bottom, I was gonna say right to left, left to right. So in the section in the lighter green area, it's garlic mustard at the top left, strangling dog vine beside it, Himalayan balsam one down from it, Phragmites, invasive, there is a native, it's much smaller, purple loosestrife and autumn olive. And on the top, in the dark green bar on the travel left and right, Japanese knotweed on one side and buckthorn, that looks like common buckthorn on the top right. Ethics of collection. So in short, we're trying to act with fairness in the interest of sustainability of existing habitats, act with respect for the land, public spaces, and managed landscapes. And if collecting seed for future use, learn about and ensure you're using appropriate seed collection techniques. I think it's really important to observe what craftspeople are using locally and have used historically. Some things change, some things have grown reliably over time, despite the introduction of invasives, and might be welcome additions to your palette. Other things were brought in and have either naturalized, so they're not necessarily pushing natives out of an area, but you can find them in sort of healthy communities that aren't. I often think of describing invasives as bullies. There are some plants that have naturalized without really displacing entire communities, whereas there's others like buckthorn, the poster child of invasives, which will basically preclude anything else from growing near it. And it really slows down natural succession in forests from field to forest. Sustainable harvesting only works if everyone's working in the same respectful way. If there are 10 people who come by to forage the same space and people aren't being aware that this space has already maybe been harvested from, that could have a really huge impact, even if everybody's only taking 5% or 10%. Like it's very much going and being aware and taking a look how things fit in context and, leaving enough when you're dealing with native species for really proper, regrowth, things going to seed and going back out into the ecosystem, or possibly when you're looking at invasives, if you're removing all of the invasives in an area, making sure you're kind of not making a mess of everything. Because a lot of times we're foraging in spaces that are public or federally, provincially, or sort of crown lands. And while they're not managed, they're there and all of us would like to enjoy them. So yeah, considering how much a plant material grows in a year, if it's negatively impacted by the harvest, or if it shoots up just as vigorously the following year. If you're using willow bark for dyes or birch bark for dyes, and you've got a colony, which is literally many, many shoots coming up off the same root system, that root system's right there, and it's going to come back every year, and it will send up fresh shoots every year. So that's a very reliably harvestable material. That's really nice. And just making sure that your collections aren't impacting, or being aware of how your collections impact seed distribution or spores, because like as I say with the buckthorn, we're going to be using the berries, and those berries then do not have the opportunity to be eaten by birds, carried a distance, and then redistributed. So that's good. More specifically, I really don't recommend that you enter private property without permission, respect all posted signage, get permission and guidance from owners and caretakers of the property where plants are growing if it's an area that appears to be a managed landscape. Most people, when you go to talk to them or leave a note in the mailbox, I've always found people be really amiable. I was part of a seed collection programs for growing native trees. And it was, we had a leaflet and a little explanation of, what we'd like to do and what we're there for. And generally, people who are taking care of a property are interested to learn about what's going on or how these things could be used. So that always seemed to go well. Understand the legal protections surrounding species at risk in your area, and really taking care to avoid damage to sensitive habitats and ongoing restoration efforts. All right, that's a whole lot of serious talk on basically how to be kind and be fair. Here is a palette of weeds that was sent to me by a friend who often comes with me and is dying, and we share dye vats and we all go out and harvest and we have great fun. So from Amelia Merriman, we have from left to right, I should use the pointer, please hold tight. So from left to right, we have making sure I'm doing this right. Yes. I think the yellows aren't showing correctly in this picture. You guys will mileage will vary because can you see the laser pointer? Possibly yes, possibly no. The one on the far left should be a goldish color. It should be sort of sunshiny yellow. And that would be goldenrod. Most of them were mortared with alum. We tend to prep our fiber in bulk, and then things can be sort of easily tossed into the dye pot. These were all started from just combed fleece or carded fleece, and they were later spun. I'll talk more about that. So the first one's goldenrod. The second is modified with iron, and the third had some iron from an exhausted iron bath. Then is followed with onion skin with iron as the second one. Not a big shift from the one to the other, but you can see the iron, we sort of describe it as saddening the color. Buckthorns are my favorite. I've got more for show and tell later that make just a stunning green, although it looks very bluish to me on my screen. And then an exhaust bath from the same buckthorn. Then black walnut is the first really brown skein. And the second one to its right is black walnut with iron. And the iron reacts with the tannins in the black walnut and makes just this beautiful chocolatey brown. Followed by sumac. Sumac isn't a really fast dye, staghorn sumac berries. It is really pH sensitive, but it is a lovely pink, and Amelia loves her pinks, so it's in there because we love it, and it is readily accessible. Probably the eastern half of the country from The Minnesota's on over. I can't tell you about further west. Where am I? Oh, pokeberry. Pokeberry or pokeweed, or there's a few other common names for it. It is a fairly toxic native plant, but it makes some beautiful paints with very little fuss, and the berries are plentiful, and the plant will come back again and again and again. So year after year, if you find one, you can find that dye again, sort of, so long as it doesn't suffer serious mishap. And then pokeberry with vinegar prep because it's also affected by pH. And then we've got Indy Rubin, which is a byproduct of indigo dyeing. I had done some indigo fresh leaf fermentations, and there was a lot of red from the Indy Rubin, which is a part of the process that sometimes happens. And since it was a very red dye bath after I precipitated the indigo out, we dyed with that. So it made a nice cream color. And then she treated it with OxyClean to strip out the extra color, which made sort of a bright, clean, creamy color. And then an indigo bath that was a very small batch, and so there wasn't a lot of pigment in it. And then again, cleaned with OxyClean. This is a series that she's going to use for embroidering. She described them as generic meat fleece, aka an unknown breed with relatively high crimp and a bit of a textured scratchy. She spun them S-ply, S single Z ply at about a fingering weight, so about 12 ends per inch or warp per inch, wraps per inch. All these were dyed first and then spun, basically due to some limitations for her of timing of harvesting. And the plan is to use all of these in an embroidery project using tent stitch on 14 count canvas. All right, my 5 foraging favorites, and I'll show colors from these later. Buckthorn berries. The busiest time for a dyer, if you're using everything fresh, is fall. There are lots that can be dried for later use in winter when you have less to do. That's kind of good. But really, most of these are coming ripe and should be collected in the fall seasons. So buckthorn berries are available really from, buckthorn berries produce different colors depending on the time of year when you collect them. So from their unripe stages, which they are at through June to September, depending on your latitude, through to November. They honestly will hold their berries sometimes into the winter, but usually the birds get most of them by that point. But they are ripe, usually September through November. Could certainly be earlier the further south you go. Goldenrod, most varieties are good for this. The flowering tops, I would say June or July through September. Again, I'm sort of adding the extra month, thinking about as you go further south, certainly they're going to be flowering earlier for you. Black walnuts, the husks are a completely fast dye. They don't need their fiber to be mordanted. They will dye you, they will dye your sidewalk, they will dye your shoes. And they make a beautiful chocolate brown with just a little addition of iron. But on their own, they're still a very nice brown. Pokeberry is toxic, all parts of the plants, although you can, in theory, eat the leaves if they're boiled and the water is changed out numerous times. You know, I think there's other greens that are safer and more edible. But the berries, so we're not using our cook pots for this, ideally, are easily collected sort of July through September. And wild grapes, usually you're seeing sort of our native grapes, not the ones that were crossed with or brought over from Europe. They're small, I want to say sort of the size of peas. And you'll see them in clusters, and sometimes they're running up trees, and they're native plants. And they can make beautiful, stunning purples. And so long as you're willing to dye that object yearly, it's a great purple. They're not very fast, but they're beautiful. And they're pretty easy.
Yeah. There's a question about pokeberry yarns and fading. Have you tested that?
I haven't. I'm hoping that Amy will do a sample card up with me with these this sort of palette that she's done. I've got fade tests on the buckthorn because I was told, oh no, buckthorn fades terribly. So I threw it in a window for 3 months, and here's some of the examples of it. So I can't say it for pokeberry. Most berries fade fairly quickly. I mean, it's sort of broadly true. Most reds we have aren't very light fast. I was from Eldermere for most of my thing, and Eldermere red is really a shade of pink because we all look a little sun bleached after a few summers in our linen anyhow. So there we are. Any follow-up questions for that one? Because I can't see the chat.
Nothing yet.
Wonderful. Just catch me if you need me.
Okay.
Buckthorn, I love your dye, but so I've got some images of my light fast tests. I can hold them up in front of the camera, but I suspect that it's a little bit easier to read on this screen. I've got a number of things with buckthorn here because, as I said, I worked growing native trees, and so we spent a lot of time removing buckthorn actively and aggressively to try and make space back for native species. So buckthorn was, let's go from the start here. If I could tear every last stem from North America, native species would have a lot more room to grow. Historically, we have plenty of references for buckthorn as a leather dye, as a fabric dye, and as a lake or a pigment. While different species were used for, and different shades can be achieved by what time the berries are harvested or where the plants came from, all buckthorns are very, very similar and seem to act basically the same. I haven't gotten any results different from common buckthorn or glossy buckthorn or the Persian buckthorn that's sold for dyeing. So I'm not really seeing any difference. So when it comes to using it, you know, aside from our basic courtesy for land and caretakers, the more the merrier. If you use them up, they can't grow. The original plants will still make thousands and thousands of seeds next year, but at least in a small way, you can sort of have an impact. Buckthorns were brought into North America for hedgerows. So you'll see them all over the place in borders. On my property, they run the edge of what used to be a railway line, but they make a very, very thick hedgerow that deer and, you know, native animals don't tend to eat because it's not quite toxic, but it is certainly not digestible. So they grow well. They've got nothing, you know, chewing it down, like, or at least, you know, willows and other things are edible to most animals. They grow quickly. They work wonderfully as windbreaks. They just don't belong here. And they can grow in a lot of soil types. So they can pop up just about anywhere, and they're quite difficult to take out because if there's some of the root systems left behind, they often will shoot back up because they store a lot of resources in the ground. Like willows, you can cut willows down every year in coppicing, and you can basically make them immortal by cutting them down and letting them regrow fresh over and over again, because the root system is where all the important resources are held through winter. But buckthorns, they have thousands of seeds a year per plant. Birds really like to eat them and redistribute them. One of the scientific names said berries travel through said birds, but they do travel quite far and are redistributed by birds mostly. All of these samples were dyed with the very ripe berries. So I can get more for my sample swatches, but mostly I'm doing this for, I got what I would best describe as an emerald green on silk, and I think it is divine. The color fast tests on the top left, there's a stripe of rainbow beside it to hopefully help color correct it for everybody to sort of see. 3 months of fading, you can see the difference, but Honestly, in my opinion, it's not that bad for a natural dye. Obviously, it's not as resilient as something like indigo, but at the same time, indigo most natural dyes. I did a bit of sampling because you can also change its color through pH. And the baths were vividly different colors, like could be used as a pH test. But honestly, after they had dried and been rinsed and kind of rinsed back to closer to neutral, they were all varying shades of green at the end. Whereas the dye baths absolutely were. The dye bath with added lye was for sure like this green, green, green. And the neutral one was very bluish, sort of emeraldy forest green. And the one with vinegar added was, I'd best describe as a raspberry color. Um, but it didn't stay that color after they dried and were rinsed. So um, fun just sort of as a like, well, this is almost the pH paper of a solution. And on the bottom, I've got all sorts of different materials we were dyeing with it. Right. I grow a lot of plants to round out sort of my color wheel. I like to be able to have, the big bold colors. And okay, yeah. So goldenrod, buckthorn, and there are some reds that can be found, but they're less plentiful. So red is definitely a thing that's always like, oh, I guess if I want that, I'm probably going to have to grow my own or import it from the friendly merchants, often Maiwa. But I do grow Japanese indigo, weld, dire sunflowers, and coreopsis, just sort of to add into what I have. But I have space to grow these. Some, like Japanese indigo, are really easy to grow in pots on a patio and have enough to like play with. You're not going to dye a whole garment, but you could do some small things, and silk by weight is really quite light, so little dye goes a long ways. And I like to think of this sort of in the economy because this is all fun I get to do on the side of things, not putting a lot of resources into it. It's kind of this seed from indigo, Japanese indigo, has very limited viability, but I have certainly found by storing it well sealed in the fridge, I've managed to have seed from 2 and 3 years still regrow. So it's nice to not have to have a functional crop brought all the way from, seedlings to setting their own seed each year, because it doesn't belong here, but I'm not worried about it because it cannot survive our frosts, and it has no invasive tendencies because set seed and reproduce. So I can grow it in the garden with fair confidence that it's not taking over anywhere. That's not true of some of this list in some ecosystems. If you are in Alberta and you want to grow woad, I think it's on the noxious list. So take that into consideration. There's a number of the dye plants from Europe that are, as I say, so vigorous and so prolific with seed that I think they had more of an impact before agriculture switched over to all the herbicides. So I will say that and leave that there. Other plants are, sorry, yep.
Oh, I was going to say, we have two questions. One going back to buckthorn, does the pH of the soil of the buckthorn change the color of the dye?
I will say not that I've seen. I've gotten it from fields and forests and bogs.
Okay.
Bogs would definitely be a more acidic pH. So not that I've experienced, although I know some dye plants will be much more vigorous and produce more of the dye pigments if they're grown in a really rich soil. Madder likes rich, well drained, and a lot of it was grown in Flanders for that reason. It's also easier to dig out roots if you've got a nice sandy soil, so that certainly had an impact on where it was grown in production, and was certainly sent across. And second question?
Could you grow woad in a raised bed? Or somehow, how would you make it so it wouldn't spread?
Woad is really simple. We as dyers want to use the first year's growth. Woad and weld are both biennials. There's probably some weld that'll put up a flower spike in the first year, and the same is true for woad. So, so for woad, yeah, I mean, containing it's not a great challenge. Weld, its seeds are much smaller. So unlike what you could do with woad, like putting a cloth bag around the seeds, if you personally wanted to collect the seeds and maintain that they didn't enter into the ecosystem, then you could do like a sheer mesh bag or paper bags tied around a section that you allow to flower and go to seed. So you would let it flower on its own, and then you would cover it after it starts to set seed, so the seed cannot drop and disperse or be dispersed by animals without you having some control over it. So there's different ways to control when you're doing a small plot. And I mean, you would only need one woad plant, ideally the most vigorous woad plant, to set you up with seeds for the next, however many years that seed is viable, because it produces hundreds, thousands of seeds. Weld is the same, many seeds, but honestly, they're very small. And because you collect weld in its second year, so not the first year when it grows a little compact rosette, but the second year it sends up a big tall flower spike, about 6 feet if it's really happy. And you let them bloom up the length of the flower spike. And by the time it's all in bloom, some of that flower spike has already set viable seeds. And usually I gather the seeds out of the whole of it when I have dried it and I've sort of ground it down to use it.
A couple more questions that popped up is, are you using a native elderberry?
Yes. So some, yeah, Sambucus, black elderberry is my preferred. I like it because it's really good. I'm in Nova Scotia on hills, and it is really good for hanging onto the edge of a hill and sitting in kind of somewhat boggy areas, and it will put up with that and think it's delightful. I mean, I also like it for cordials and a million other things, but every so often I use it to dye sort of small project size skeins of yarn and stuff.
Okay. And the last question is, which species is the buckthorn that you're talking about?
I have used both common and glossy. They're what grow sort of on the eastern side of North America. They're what was brought over from Europe. The difference is kind of obvious. Once you can identify a buckthorn, there's certain shapes to its leaves, the leaf margins, and it has slightly sub-opposite vein structure, which when you get into plant ID will make sense. They look like the veins on the leaves are beside each other, but just not quite. So it's called sub-opposite. All of the buckthorns have that. And the difference, quick ID between common and glossy is the leaf shiny. They flower at slightly different times, and the fruit on the common tends to go ripe all at once, whereas the fruit on the glossy buckthorn goes ripe in sort of slow succession, which will make gathering just the underripe berries a bit of a nuisance, but if I time it right, it should be okay. I have mostly glossy around me now. In Ontario, we had mostly common, but I could find the glossy buckthorn around and in forests, and then we would tear it out. So, yeah, I think I've got one more slide that says, yeah, what do you want to get more into? Let's discuss. I will turn this off, and I'm going to show and tell a few fabrics. Let me check my time. I'm running a little long, but that's not bad. Screen share. Stop share. Hello. All right. So Mm. It is really hard to show color. On the green, the dark green, hopefully it looks like a green, is the emerald green of buckthorn on silk. This is goldenrod on silk. Actually, wait, no. This is goldenrod on silk. I have a stash of fabrics beside me. And like I was trying to show with Amelia's sort of palette she made, or took a picture of me for, if you take goldenrod and the flowering tops and you boil them, and I like adding a little bit of alum, it really brightens the dye bath. So just the goldenrod tops, boiled, strained with alum, makes this beautiful yellow that is almost as vivid as the weld, which is the European. And then on the right, I've got a bit of a goose turd green. That is what happens when you add a bit of iron into the mix, which is a lovely color. This is one of my apron dresses. And it actually, it's probably more than a decade old and it's held up really well. So I would call that reasonably sun-fast. Whereas here is some brilliant buttery yellow weld on wool, a bit on silk. Just handing them across my thing. This is more goldenrod on with iron on silk. Oh, there's my buckthorn on wool, just from this fall. Let's see. Let me see if I put a contrasting color behind it, with a bag that had been dyed with madder at some point behind it. So, all right, I can see the chat now, maybe. And we'll field some questions, or are there things people want to focus on or circle back around to or have more questions about? Hopefully we're all here sort of help each other start out and make some colors in honestly the most economical way I can think of. Oh, I've got a hand up for Morgan.
Hi, I do have a question, but first, I do conservation as my day job mundanely, and I deal with invasives all the time, so I've been fangirling this entire class over how well you're teaching things.
I did a couple years and it was okay, so we're going to build a trees program. I worked in a city and they're reforesting underused areas of a city, and we're like, okay, and they're all covered with buckthorn. Yep. Let's go.
So I'm in Arkansas and I'm not sure if buckthorn is as common and invasive here as it is where you're at, but we do have Chinese privet. And I was wondering, I think I've heard before that you can dye with it, but I don't know for sure. And I was wondering if you had any information on that.
So there are lots of, I don't have information offhand on privet, I think. I know with like the buckthorn, you can also dye with the wood. So the first question is like, you might take a leaf and drag it across something and see if it leaves any stains behind. And that's kind of, it sounds dumb. It's kind of a place to start. And then if you cut and do a cross section of the wood, if it has a really strong colored heartwood, then usually you can get colors out of that. Or if the cabium layer is really bright, like with buckthorn, it is pumpkin orange. So you're like, I could get dye out of that. How much work will it be? Sometimes it's just, finding a way to peel it or chop it up and simmer it. Wood chippers are a perfectly reasonable way to mulch a large amount of weld. So I'm sure it would do as well for privet or buckthorn if you were trying to get sort of the woody stems to make a dye bath. But honestly, I say to some extent, so long as you're careful about, to everyone, so long as you're careful about moving these invasives around, give it a try and share your results. We'd all like to know more and more artsy ways to destroy the problems. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
You're welcome.
There's another question in the chat with regard to seeds gathered. Are you grinding them for additional dye or using leaves and roots woad?
Typically the leaves of woad, though I know you can use the seeds. I have never effectively managed to get any color out of them. I got sort of a slight gray. The seeds gathering, usually I'm doing that in the sense of like, if there was like when I'm gathering the buckthorn seeds and using them fresh and ripe, I'm actually discarding most of the actual seed material, but when you use them underripe, you grind some of the seed material in, and that is being used in the pigment. I didn't find whether I included weld seeds in the dye bath or not that it particularly changed the color much. I did trial that once, but it wasn't really significant enough to go whether it was worth sort of intending to leave seeds in or not. In that case, you're looking for like the flowering material. Same as like Dyer's green weed is a weed in a number of places that makes brilliant yellows, and it absolutely was brought over from Europe. So. Purple dead nettles give a lovely pale green. So do stinging nettles. Wear your gloves. Pokeberries intimidate you. Don't lick the dying. That's my good advice. No, I understand being intimidated by things that are toxic and trying to be concerned about it. But as you know, toxicity goes, this is not aconite. You are not generally, wear gloves, but when maintaining good sort of health and safety, modern health and safety hygienes, so long as you're not getting in contact with your skin, and if you're really concerned, wear a pair of glasses, but that's probably overkill as far as concerns. I only pull out the full face glasses when I'm making lye soap, so or soldering, but that's a different side quest. I was wondering, so interesting to learn about Arkansas. Are there people from out west, further west, that can tell me more about what they're seeing around them or what they've tried around them that's prolific and makes good dye colors?
Well, I suspect you could do well, at least in the city here, doing tansy. I keep collecting it and never managing to dye with it, but it's here. So, and that's a plant that the city keeps spraying herbicides on. So I suspect they'd be very happy if you got rid of it for them. Let's see.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of flowers that, if they're bright enough, will make a dye. How fast they are, you get to find out. I mean, I know, so let's see. These are indigo stampings, but also coreopsis, which you'll sometimes see in gardens, but also out in the wild. Makes this brilliant yellow, and you can actually see where the orangey centers of them is a bit brown. So when in doubt, it sounds silly, but like smear it against a piece of paper, see how it holds up, see if it's light fast. And it's a real quick and dirty way to go, is this worth a shot? Does it make a real color? Is it bold? Like I know people who have dyed with rose mallow and shown sort of lovely pinks and purples. But I don't know, as I say, none of these maybe are forever colors, but sometimes they're beautiful long enough to be worth it.
We certainly have goldenrod here too.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, various goldenrods if you are energetic at the right time. Something that I've dyed with is my brain just left. Nope. Sorry, I'm tired and the word
No, that's okay. All the folks from West are like, what time was this glass? I understand.
Yeah,
but it's a place I don't have a lot of perspective on it. I've got some friends out in Seattle and we visited them, but it was a blur.
Alien Boreale, and I'm trying to remember bedstraw. There we go.
Yeah.
Northern bedstraw roots.
Mm-hmm.
You have to have a place where it's A, abundant. I mean, it's not an uncommon plant, and B, not too hard to dig, and then you can treat it like madder.
Yep,
And I
yep.
salmon colors from it. I haven't gotten anything brighter than that, but you can get
Yeah,
an.
it's and I mean the bed straws look a lot like madder. They're sort of cousins. And so you'll see different bed straws which have these little tiny whorls of leaves, little spear-shaped leaves in like a little umbrella formation, and they're along stems, and the stems might be smooth or prickly. But if you see that, you can go and look at plant ID, figure out what it is, decide if it's belongs there, is invasive, or is usually they're invasive. I've got a lot of prickly ones that I will be digging out, and usually, fortunately, the roots are usually in the top, sort of the richer part of the soil level. So they're relatively easy to dig out, but they tend to pop back up again because you never get all of the roots. It's how madder beds are reestablished. I mean, in medieval times, there was certainly a trade in slips and selling, the replacements. But if you have a bed and you're not thorough about getting every root out, that's okay, because it is still your madder bed, and you can have a couple of those and you can work them sort of successively over a series of years. And if you have 3 beds, then you get to harvest madder every year, and every year you're harvesting, some nice chunky 3-year-old roots, and away you go.
Oxeye daisies work too, but you need a lot, like four to one. But that's all right, since there are lots and lots of them. If you want a nice soft yellow, you can get a nice soft yellow from oxeye daisies. The flowering heads,
Yep.
leaves.
Yeah, and you say 4 to 1. I don't know how many dyers are out there, but a lot of times we talk about weight of fiber versus weight of plant material. And working fresh, obviously, the fresh weight is a lot heavier than dried weight, so you kind of have to look at, most formulas are dealing with dried weight. So sometimes you need more fresh material to dye the same amount of fiber. But when they are things that are as prolific as goldenrod, and I have stood in fields of goldenrod, which is not the dreaded ragweed that many are so allergic to. I am myself. Goldenrod is just this beautiful, vigorous. It's native here. It's native in Nova Scotia, in Ontario, and I assume I've seen it more or less everywhere from coast to coast. I don't know how far south it is, but it is the most prolific and accessible yellow, and it likes disturbed sites. It likes crummy soil that doesn't have a ton of organic matter. It'll do really well if it gets into some soil with a lot of organic matter, but it can also, because its seeds are blown in, you'll often see it early on in sort of scrubby fields or things that have gone fallow. And usually no one's going to bat an eye if you run off with a couple grocery bags of it. And that'll be more than enough to fill a, dye vat that I can put my arms around, and it's about 2 feet tall. So, I see a message. Yeah, oxeye daisy is invasive, please use. I would love to stop seeing it show up in that and Shasta daisy in wildflower mixes. What is invasive in one area is not invasive in another. Same is true for natives. I think it's the Shasta daisies are native to Alaska and not really anywhere else. I can't remember if that's right or if it's the other. There's one that was a cross with something. I'm on the East Coast, and we have lupins everywhere, and they're beautiful, and they're in all the ditches, and they don't belong here. There are a couple native lupins. Most of the lupins belong on the west side of the Rockies, but they're a beautiful garden plant that's a nitrogen fixer that has established itself well out here and puts up with our climate. So it's everywhere. Is it a native plant in North America? Yes, just not where we are.
Mm-hmm.
So there are things like that where I say regionality really matters. And, if you're choosing to plant something, be really mindful of like, will this get out of hand? And, woad is really easy. Okay, we're just not going to let you go to seed. Or if we do, we're going to put some controlling measures in if I'm somewhere where it's problematic. As I say, Alberta has rules around it. And generally I try and follow rules so long as they make some sense. So, I am sure there are cases that can be made for other things where you go, why is that on the noxious or invasive, or why is that on the noxious species list? Ah, that is no longer a problem right now. But yeah. So what's our time? Oh, we've got 7 minutes left. iNaturalist is a wonderful app. I think I meant to mention this at some point. I gave the links for a couple plant identification things for different regions. I use a plant app on my phone occasionally because my ability to identify a seedling that's this big is pretty limited. But when enough people use a database, computers get pretty good at IDing things. Not always right, helps to have your own impressions and to know a little bit about the plants you're looking for, to be like, it tells me it's a spotted Joe Pye. And I look at it and I go, yeah, I kind of think that this is a Joe Pye. If it's giving me a very specific thing, that might be so, but it's at least agreeing with what I know about it. And over time, you get to go see another seedling and you go, oh, okay, I know what that is. I can spot weld seedlings just about anywhere, and they can be this big when they just start out, because they start out from seeds that are under a millimeter. They're about 0.5 millimeter round. And sometimes they have just the tiny, they look like microscopic little crinkled dandelions. And now that I know what they look like, I can spot them. So if you're in a place where they've become invasive or naturalized, or they're out in the wild, you can spot them when they're those tiny little rosettes and go, right, I got to come back here in a year and get some of my own. So there's things like that where we're learning a little bit of plant ID for ones that, make the beautiful colors. Where's my weld again?
Do you have any conversation about using barks? I mean, there are clearly conservation questions. Alder bark is a good, red alder or come on, I'm not. I think Alnus and Canna. Sorry, I can't remember what the proper common name is. Those are Western plants like British Columbia. They make good colors, and they were used by the indigenous people, and they're pretty weedy. So I don't feel weird about using alder bark, but I could imagine, you have to think about what kind of bark you're willing to take because it's going to damage the tree.
Yeah, and I mean certain plants, so alders, willows, birches, I mean they all boil back to being poplars of a sort. They can cut back and regrow effectively. So if you're looking at gathering bark from something that's sort of small and this big around, as opposed to a whole tree trunk, you actually get a whole lot more bark on a small narrow stem, and they're usually easier to peel. So if you can find young plants in a community that's well established, and you cut back the young plants, and that's called coppicing, you cut back one young plant, 6 are going to grow up the next year. You're going to cut back those 6, you might get a dozen growing back in that area the year after. So that's those sort of species of plants that are often used as barks were used as barks because they grew back quickly. Unlike when where the use of like paper birches in canoes, you have to wait for a full-grown tree to get the span of bark that you need for that project. For dye plants, you're using the bark. Sure, you want that cambium, that growth layer, and on young, on small diameter stuff, there's pretty decent diameter of bark to a fairly small thing, and they can really be successively harvested very effectively. Just double check that it's not a species at risk in your area. And, if you can observe that, as I say, there's sort of a community, a good grouping and network of trees in that area, and it's not the only spot you find it in your region, then you can probably feel pretty confident making a reasonable harvest and using it.
Sorry, quick question on this subject. I'm still new. Well, I'm learning about dyeing. I've not really done much. Can you use like deadfall for bark, or does it have to be living when you harvest it?
So long as it can be deadfall, you're better to go out looking like after storms than for deadfall that's numerous years old, because there are biologic processes that break down all the materials, and so you could lose the properties to time and literal degradation. So if it's freshly fallen, it's going to have all the same attributes of harvested, like freshly harvested. If it's been on the ground and composting in place for a number of years, it might not. On the other hand, take a small sample, give it a try, and see what can be done. There's a lot of when you're just getting started, it's delightful because you get to find all the things that work. It helps to, be pointed in some directions, and knowing what region you're from, people can sort of reach out and help. But there's a lot of opportunities that, goldenrod usually literally in the ditches, buckthorn, as they say, on sort of the eastern half of the continent. It's prolific and it's pretty much everywhere. And once you know what to look for, wait for the right time and harvest the berries. Pokeweed berries are so vibrantly fuchsia, raspberry red, that they're honestly most dangerous to small children who think that they look tasty. But beyond that, they're easy to spot at a distance. And once you get to know the plants, you start to know its sort of habit, and how it's sort of, when the berries get ripe, they start to hang heavy, and you can sort of spot that from a distance. But you'll find them in parks. You'll find them just sort of stuck between things in an alley, because birds will eat them and distribute them everywhere. So it just starts to be keeping your eye out for things and looking at it and going, look like greenweed, and then double checking across the app, or looking at your book and going, okay, yeah, you could be that. Is there enough of you to do anything with? Is it in a place where it will, taking it will affect the ecosystem? Yeah, if there's lots and you're only taking a little sample, go find out. Little dye baths are okay. I have absolutely done little long-term soaking dye baths in mason jars and stuff, just to be like, okay, we're gonna see how this produces. Does it get more intense over time? Some do, some just get real smelly. The nettle that was solar fermented was appalling. It's not
okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to be rude and interrupt because we're right at 2 and it's time for the next class.
There we go.
So if we can kind of wrap things up.
Sorry, I've got the wrong time on my one screen. Thank you very much all for coming, and have a great one, and go find your next classes.